December 18, 1941. The Mediterranean stretched black and still beneath a moonless sky. Lieutenant Luigi Duran de la Penne crouched in the belly of the submarine Ciré, listening to the hull creak as seawater pressed against riveted steel. His breathing echoed inside the cramped compartment, shallow, controlled, the rhythm of a man preparing to die. He wasn't alone in that preparation. Beside him sat 5 other men, their faces pale in the red glow of the emergency lighting. They wore rubber suits that smelled of gasoline and sweat, the material thick enough to trap body heat but thin enough to tear on coral. Each man checked his equipment in silence. Oxygen rebreathers, depth gauges, waterproof compasses, no bigger than pocket watches. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. They'd volunteered for this 6 months ago, back when the war still felt like something Italy could win. Now, in the winter of 41, with British convoys strangling the North African supply lines and Mussolini's grand empire crumbling into dust, this mission wasn't about victory. It was about proving that Italian sailors could strike fear into the heart of the Royal Navy even if it killed them. De la Penne ran his thumb across the face of his compass. The glass was fogged from the humidity. He wiped it clean and checked the luminous hands one more time. 30 minutes until they reached the drop point. 30 minutes until they climbed onto their maiali, their pigs, as the crews called the human torpedoes, and rowed them into Alexandria harbor, where the British battleships waited. He closed his eyes and thought of his wife, Maria. Her last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded through Naval Command in La Spezia. She'd written about their daughter's first steps, about the olive trees behind their house that needed pruning, about how she prayed for him every night before bed. He hadn't written back. What could he say? That he was about to pilot a bait, modified torpedo into the most heavily defended harbor in the Mediterranean? That his odds of survival were slim enough to fit through the eye of a needle? Some truths were better left unspoken. A metallic clang echoed through the hull. The submarine lurched, and De la Penne's stomach dropped as the Ciré began its ascent. They were approaching periscope depth. Commander Borghese would be scanning the coastline now, searching for patrol boats, destroyers, anything that might compromise their approach. Another clang. This time, it came from the forward compartment where the maiali were stored. The deck officer appeared in the hatchway, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. 2 minutes, he said. Get ready. De la Penne stood, his legs unsteady. The other men rose with him, moving like shadows in the crimson light. They formed a line, each pair of divers checking their partner's equipment, rebreather seals, fin straps, the explosive charges mounted on their belts. De la Penne's partner was Chief Diver Emilio Bianchi, a fisherman's son from Genoa who could hold his breath for 3 minutes and fix a jammed valve underwater with his eyes closed. Bianchi tugged on De la Penne's oxygen hose, testing the connection. "How's it feel, Lieutenant?" "Like I'm about to ride a torpedo into hell." Bianchi grinned. His front tooth was chipped from a bar fight in Taranto 2 years ago. "At least the water's warm." The deck officer returned, this time carrying a sealed envelope. He handed it to De la Penne without a word. Inside was a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken by a reconnaissance plane 3 days earlier. It showed Alexandria harbor from above. The breakwater, the submarine nets, the massive shapes of British capital ships moored in neat rows like sleeping giants. De la Penne's target was marked with a red circle. HMS Valiant, a 32,000-ton battleship armed with 8 15-inch guns. Beside it, another circle marked HMS Queen Elizabeth, the flagship of Admiral Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet. If they succeeded, if they managed to plant their explosive charges beneath those ships and escape before the timers ran out, they would cripple the Royal Navy's presence in the eastern Mediterranean. If they failed, their bodies would wash up on some Egyptian beach, and the war would go on without them. The submarine shuddered to a halt. The deck officer opened the hatch to the forward compartment, and cold seawater rushed in, ankle-deep, smelling of salt and diesel fuel. Beyond the hatch, the maiali waited 6 torpedoes, each 22 feet long, modified to carry two men sitting astride like riders on a mechanical horse. They were painted black, their hulls slick with grease, their propellers silent and deadly. De la Penne climbed through the hatch and lowered himself onto his maiale. The saddle was cold against his thighs. He gripped the steering yoke, feeling the weight of the machine beneath him, nearly 2 tons of steel, batteries, and high explosives. Bianchi settled in behind him, his hands resting on De la Penne's shoulders. "Ready?" Bianchi asked. De la Penne didn't answer. He just nodded. The deck officer gave the signal. The outer hatch opened, and the Mediterranean poured in, black and infinite. De la Penne squeezed the throttle, and the maiale lurched forward into the darkness. The first thing De la Penne noticed was the cold. It hit him like a fist, even through the rubber suit. The Mediterranean in December was warmer than the Atlantic, but at 20 feet below the surface, it was cold enough to steal the breath from your lungs. He clenched his jaw and focused on the compass strapped to his wrist. Northeast. They needed to head northeast, following the coastline until they reached the entrance to Alexandria harbor. Behind him, Bianchi tapped his shoulder twice, the signal for all clear. De la Penne adjusted the maiale's trim, tilting the nose down to maintain depth. The propeller hummed, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing inside the rebreather mask. The device recycled his exhaled air, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide and feeding him pure oxygen. It was supposed to keep him underwater for up to 4 hours. Supposed to. The Italian Navy's equipment was good, but it wasn't perfect. He'd heard stories of divers who'd blacked out from oxygen toxicity or whose rebreathers had flooded, filling their lungs with seawater before they could surface. One man had died during training when his mask cracked at depth, the pressure difference crushing his face like an eggshell. That memory lived in the back of De la Penne's mind, a dark passenger he couldn't shake. But fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. The water around them was pitch black, a void so complete that De la Penne could barely see his own hands on the steering yoke. He relied on the compass, on instinct, on the faint glow of phosphorescence stirred up by the maiale's propeller. Occasionally, a fish would dart past, a silver flash in the darkness, and he'd flinch before realizing it wasn't a mine or a patrol boat. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched into hours. His legs cramped from gripping the maiale, and his back ached from holding the same position. Bianchi tapped his shoulder again, this time 3 taps, the signal for checkpoint. De la Penne checked his watch. They'd been underwater for 40 minutes. If his calculations were correct, they were less than half a mile from the harbor entrance. Then he saw it. A pale shape in the water ahead, suspended like a ghost. At first he thought it was a reef, but as they drew closer, the shape resolved into something man-made. A steel net, its mesh wide enough to catch a submarine but tight enough to snag a maiale. The British had strung it across the harbor entrance, a barrier designed to keep out exactly what De la Penne was trying to bring in. He slowed the maiale and brought it to a halt, hovering in the water column. Bianchi tapped his shoulder urgently. What now? De la Penne studied the net. It was anchored to the seabed with concrete blocks, and the top edge floated just below the surface, held up by steel buoys. There was no way to go over it, no way to go around it. The only option was to go under. He tilted the maiale's nose down and pushed the throttle forward. The machine descended, the pressure increasing with every foot. His ears popped, his chest tightened. The depth gauge on his wrist read 40 feet, then 50, then 60. The net's lower edge came into view, swaying gently in the current. 70 feet, 80. The maiale bucked as it scraped against the seabed, kicking up a cloud of silt. De la Penne's vision blurred. His lungs burned despite the oxygen flowing into his mask. They were too deep. The rebreather wasn't designed for this depth. Bianchi pounded on his back. Go! 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 De la Penne gunned the throttle. The maiale surged forward, its propeller churning through mud and sand. The net's edge passed overhead, close enough to touch. Then they were through, on the other side, inside Alexandria harbor. De la Penne angled the maiale upward, desperate for shallower water. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Just a little farther, just a little. The maiale broke through 30 feet and leveled out. De la Penne's head cleared. His breathing slowed. Bianchi tapped his shoulder once, good job. But there was no time to celebrate. Ahead, through the murky water, de la Penne could see the silhouettes of ships, dozens of them. Destroyers, cruisers, cargo vessels, all moored in neat rows, their hulls black against the faint glow of the harbor lights above. And beyond them, towering over the smaller ships like cathedrals of steel, were the battleships HMS Valiant, HMS Queen Elizabeth. De la Penne's target, he checked his watch. 12 minutes past midnight. They had less than 6 hours before sunrise, less than 6 hours to plant their charges, escape the harbor, and rendezvous with the Cirré offshore. He squeezed the throttle and aimed for the battleship's shadow. The Valiant loomed above them like a mountain. De la Penne brought the maiale to a stop 50 feet from the battleship's hull, close enough to see the barnacles crusted along the waterline. The ship was massive, over 600 feet long, with a beam wide enough to park a train on. Its 8 main guns jutted from twin turrets, each barrel thick as a redwood tree. Even at rest, it radiated power. And somewhere aboard that ship, British sailors were sleeping, dreaming, oblivious to the 2 Italian divers hovering in the water below. Bianchi tapped de la Penne's shoulder and pointed upward. They needed to surface, to scout the ship's position and confirm their target before planting the charge. De la Penne nodded and adjusted the maiale's trim, bringing it slowly upward until his head broke through the surface. The night air hit him like a slap. He pulled off his rebreather mask and gasped, filling his lungs with oxygen that didn't taste like rubber and chemicals. The harbor was quiet, eerily so. A few lights glowed along the docks, and he could hear the faint hum of a generator somewhere in the distance. But no alarms, no searchlights, no patrol boats racing toward them. They were invisible. Bianchi surfaced beside him, water streaming from his mask. He pointed toward the Valiant's stern. There, the keel's about 15 feet down. We can attach the charge just forward of the propellers. De la Penne nodded. That was the plan. Plant the explosive charge, a 300-pound warhead packed with amytal, beneath the ship's keel, where the blast would crack the hull like an egg. The timer was set for 6 hours, giving them just enough time to escape before the charge detonated. If everything went according to plan, they dove again, dragging the maiale down to the ship's keel. The water here was darker, colder, filled with the scent of oil and rust. De la Penne maneuvered the maiale into position, directly beneath the Valiant's engine room. Bianchi released the charge, a cylindrical metal container attached to the maiale by a magnetic clamp. It drifted downward, settling against the ship's hull with a soft clang. Bianchi checked the timer. 6 hours. He armed the device, twisting the detonator cap until it clicked into place. Then, the maiale died. The propeller stopped. The battery indicator on the control panel flickered and went dark. De la Penne squeezed the throttle, but nothing happened. The machine was dead weight now, sinking slowly toward the seabed. Bianchi grabbed his arm, his eyes wide behind his mask. What do we do? De la Penne's mind raced. They couldn't abandon the maiale. It would be discovered by morning, and the British would find the charge. Their entire mission would be compromised. But they couldn't stay here either. They had to surface, had to get out of the harbor before the charge detonated. He made a decision. He tapped Bianchi's shoulder and pointed upward. Surface. Surrender. Bianchi stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But de la Penne was already moving, kicking toward the surface with Bianchi close behind. They broke through the water beside the Valiant's hull, gasping for air, and that's when the searchlight found them. It hit them like the sun, blinding white, turning the water around them into daylight. De la Penne raised his hands, shielding his eyes. Bianchi did the same. A voice shouted from the deck above English, harsh and urgent. "Hands up! Don't move!" De la Penne looked up and saw a dozen British sailors staring down at them. Rifles pointed. He didn't move. They dragged de la Penne and Bianchi onto the deck like fish, their rubber suits dripping seawater onto polished steel. A ring of sailors surrounded them, weapons raised, faces hard with suspicion. One of them, a lieutenant, judging by his uniform, stepped forward and barked something in English. De la Penne didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" De la Penne said nothing. He kept his hands raised, his expression blank. Beside him, Bianchi trembled not from fear, but from cold. The night air was freezing against their wet skin. The lieutenant barked another order, and two sailors hauled de la Penne to his feet. They marched him across the deck, past gun turrets and ventilation shafts, toward a hatch leading below decks. The Valiant was enormous. From the inside, a maze of corridors and compartments, all steel and shadows. They shoved him into a small room, bare except for a wooden chair and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The lieutenant closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. "You're Italian," De la Penne nodded. "Saboteurs," another nod. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Where's the bomb?" De la Penne said nothing. The lieutenant stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "I said, where is the bomb?" Still nothing. The lieutenant stared at him for a long moment, then turned and left the room. The door slammed shut. A lock clicked. De la Penne sat in the chair and closed his eyes. He thought about Maria, about his daughter's first steps, about the olive trees that needed pruning. He thought about the charge ticking away beneath the ship's keel, counting down the seconds until it detonated. 5 hours left. He wondered if the British would evacuate the ship. He wondered if they'd find the charge in time. He wondered if he'd made the right choice by surrendering. The door opened again. This time, a different officer entered, older, gray-haired, wearing a captain's insignia. He carried a cup of tea and set it on the floor beside de la Penne's chair. "I'm Captain Morgan," he said in passable Italian, "commander of HMS Valiant. You've put me in a difficult position, Lieutenant." De la Penne looked up. The captain's face was calm, almost kind. "My men tell me you were found near the keel. They tell me you had diving equipment. I don't need to be a genius to figure out what you were doing." He paused. "So here's my question. How much time do I have?" De la Penne's throat tightened. He could warn them. He could tell them about the charge, give them a chance to evacuate before it was too late. But if he did, the mission would be for nothing. All those months of training, all the risks they'd taken wasted. He looked the captain in the eye and said, "I cannot tell you." Captain Morgan sighed. "I thought you might say that." He stood and walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, I respect your courage, but if that bomb goes off and kills my men, their blood will be on your hands." The door closed. De la Penne sat alone in the room, the weight of the captain's words pressing down on him like the ocean above. 4 hours left. 3, 2. At 5:30 in the morning, with the first light of dawn creeping through the porthole, de la Penne heard footsteps in the corridor. The door opened, and Captain Morgan appeared, his face pale. "The charge," de la Penne said quietly. "It's beneath your keel. You have 15 minutes. Captain Morgan didn't waste time with questions. He turned and shouted orders, and within seconds the Valiant erupted into chaos. Sailors poured onto the deck, racing for the lifeboats. Alarms blared, officers barked commands. De la Penne and Bianchi were dragged topside and thrown into a motorboat alongside a dozen British sailors. The boat roared away from the Valiant, carving a white wake across the harbor. They were 200 yards away when the charge detonated. The explosion was silent at first, a deep, bone-shaking thud that de la Penne felt in his chest before he heard it. Then the sound hit, a roar like 1,000 thunderclaps, rolling across the harbor and echoing off the buildings along the shore. The Valiant lurched, its stern lifting out of the water as a column of white foam erupted from beneath its keel. The ship settled back down, but it was lower now, listing to one side, its hull torn open below the waterline. Smoke poured from its ventilation shafts. Sailors scrambled across the deck, shouting, dragging hoses toward the fires spreading below decks. De la Penne watched in silence. He felt no triumph, no pride, just a hollow ache in his chest, Bianchi leaned close and whispered, "Did we do it?" De la Penne nodded. "We did it. But it didn't feel like victory. The British held them in a prisoner of war camp outside Alexandria for the rest of the war. De la Penne spent his days playing cards with other captured Italian sailors, writing letters to Maria that he knew she'd never receive, and wondering if the charge he'd planted had been worth the cost. He learned later that the Valiant survived. The British repaired it, patched the hull, and sent it back to sea. But for 6 critical months, it was out of action 6 months, when the Royal Navy's grip on the Mediterranean was weakened, when Axis convoys could slip through unmolested, when the war teetered on a knife's edge. And in those 6 months, De la Penne's mission, his gamble, made a difference. He returned to Italy in 1945, after the war ended. Maria was waiting for him on the dock in La Spezia, their daughter in her arms. The olive trees behind their house still needed pruning. He never spoke about Alexandria, not to Maria, not to his daughter, not to anyone. Some stories were too heavy to share, but on quiet nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the house creaked with age, he'd lie awake and think about Captain Morgan, about the British sailors who'd survived, about the men who hadn't, and he'd wonder if courage was enough, if it ever had been.